Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for having me, and it's an honor to chair this panel with several distinguished speakers at the cutting edge of the Digital Markets Act. I'll briefly introduce them. So to my far right, we have Professor Jacques McNair, who's Professor of Economics at the Toulouse School of Economics, whose Special Advisors report a few years ago started the policy debate, and he might not have imagined that that report led to the Digital Markets Act, but here we are. And sitting next to him is Tim Lam, who's Head of Europe, Middle East and Africa Competition and Regulatory Issues at Meta, who is in the regulatory crossfire and enjoying the moment. Then we have Catherine Batchelor, who's Director of the Digital Market Units at the UK CMA, and hopefully soon the pro-competition bill will become law and the Digital Markets Unit will flourish to its full potential. And then to my next to me is Lucia Bonova, who's Head of Unit for Digital Platform at DG Competition, who has not had a summer because she's been reading notifications, and soon we will be seeing the compliance reports. So the DMA becomes live in a few months when the compliance reports come in. And we'll structure this panel by me asking each panelist a set of questions, and then we'll see a little bit what sort of issues emerge. And I'll leave a few minutes at the end for people to ask questions, which are probably smarter than the questions I will ask. Now, we know that some gatekeepers have been designated. And so the question arises now, what are the main challenges that will be faced in implementing the DMA? And I'll start with Tim with this question.
So, thank you. And first, thank you for inviting me to the conference. It's an honor to be on the panel. We're just under 4 months away, I think, now from being required to comply with the substantive obligations in Article 5, 6, and 7 of the DMA. We're already complying with the M&A obligation in the DMA, and we have stood up our DMA compliance function, and the focus very much is on the sort of sprint now to DMA day, and how we get there and how we discharge our obligations under the DMA. I've heard a lot about the challenges around the timelines, around some of the interpretive uncertainty that sits in the text of the DMA, and I'm happy to talk about those, but I would actually want to approach the question of the challenge and the key challenge that we face from a slightly different perspective, which is how we make the DMA actionable and concrete for our users. And the specific point I'd want to focus on is how we design the user choice that actually underpins a number of the key provisions of the DMA. And that user choice is actually something that is potentially actionable, it is potentially measurable, and it potentially has clear user benefits in the right environment. And the challenge is then how you provide EU consumers with the DMA choices that are actually set out in the key provisions of the DMA, whether that be the data combination requirement, the provision on messaging interoperability, the provisions around browser choice, payment services or virtual assistants, and also the provisions that drive at increased choice around app distribution in Europe. And whilst all of what you see in each of those provisions is an underpinning around this idea of user choice. And that is ultimately potentially the most visible promise of the DMA, the potential for the DMA itself to provide users with meaningful product choices and just the ability to have a series of DMA choice moments. And so if you think for us, in relation to the data combination requirements set out in Article 5.2, we have a series of teams across the company thinking about how you design choice flows that are as intuitive to users as possible within the guardrails of the DMA. And those teams include a large number of senior engineers working on the technical underpinnings to control for the data flows. It also includes consumer marketing teams, product teams that are working on figuring out friendly, easy-to-use user interfaces to make that choice meaningful for our users. And that work is in full swing as we prepare for DMA Day on the 6th of March. Now the question is, how do you design those choice flows, those consent flows? And you think through some potential design principles as you do that, and I'm happy to talk about a few of those today. But fundamentally, the first principle we would think about is, well, how do you inform that choice? How do you inform the user as to the choice that they have in a clear and concise manner? So the user disclosures that you have don't have to be particularly complex. They can be very concise. After all, most of you access our services on a mobile. And so the idea is, how do you fit that onto a mobile screen? And when we design that, we often think about sort of the well-established concept out there that people don't read their privacy policies. They just accept the terms without actually reading them and understanding them. And that is not sort of optimal from a user perspective. If you want to understand the choice that you're making, it has to be provided to you in that clear, concise manner, ideally on a single mobile screen. The second is, well, how do you make that flow intuitive to users? Beyond just being concise, how do you make it intuitive? And fundamentally, I think the language that you use matters. So you want to present the choice in a language that's very easy to understand for all European languages. And perhaps one way to do that is actually to focus on the user experience that will flow from the choice that you're about to make. So potentially you don't talk about data combination, potentially you don't talk about cross-use, you talk about the experience. And I think that is possibly a good way to go, and you may have to talk about both, in fact, because they often interrelate. But you don't want to put language in front of someone which requires them to have done a law degree in order to understand what they're consenting or not consenting to. I think the third thing we're thinking about is, how do you present that choice in a neutral way? So I think you get a lot of the way there by providing that choice in a comprehensible and a concise way. But how do you avoid the idea that there is some potential deception or some potential manipulation, which is some of the concerns that Article 13 of the DMA will drive at? And then I think the fourth thing we think about is, how do you make that consent valid and meaningful? And how do you make that choice valid and meaningful? So I think if you go through the first three things I've said, you're largely on your way there. But I think that there is also a broader consideration, which is about sort of the number of choices that you're faced with, the number of consents that you have to go through, because I think it is well established as well that there is this concern around consent fatigue, and that you get lost in all these consent moments and all these choice moments. It's been commented on, I think, by the EDPB and also by the UK DPA, that has called on G7 countries to think about and revise some of the cookie banner approaches. And there's also an EU Commission initiative on that front. And I think it's important to focus on that consent fatigue as a serious consideration in this whole panoply of user choice moments, because it will drive at whether that consent is meaningful, whether users understand it, or whether they're just clicking through as quickly as possible. And I think that what we're thinking through in relation to Article 5.2 are possibly considerations that you will want to think about when you look at other provisions in the DMA that require a user choice. And it seems to me that the idea of that user choice is underplayed in a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the conferences that you go to, because it is fundamentally that user choice that is a necessary precondition for some of the aims in the DMA, notably contestability and fairness for business users. And I think understanding how that user choice could be a stepping stone or an end in itself will be important to understanding and seeing whether the DMA is ultimately a success. And I think it's actually a very good way in terms of having KPIs and output indicators to understand whether the DMA will be a success in the first place. And I'm happy to pick that up later on as well. But that's sort of the opening thoughts I had.
Thank you. That's an interesting perspective, because it requires sort of empowering the users to make use of the technology in such a way that the aims of the DMA are achieved. Let me get a different perspective, perhaps, from Jacques.
Well, first, I would like to thank the organizers to have invited me to this conference. It's a great honor to be invited to this 20th birthday of a very beautiful adolescent, and who's going to keep on leading the way in Europe in competition policy. So thank you very much. I'm very honored and flattered. So I think, when we discuss the issue of what are the main challenges implementing the DMA, we'll find ourselves in a problem, a dilemma, which we'll have all over this discussion, which is, we can go and look at the different articles and say, oh, this one is going to be difficult, this one is going to be difficult. Or we can back up and think, looking at the architecture of the DMA as a whole, what is going to be difficult to implement in a more general, and of course my notes turn off, how are we going to be, how are we going to look at this in a more general framework? So let me go to the second part of this. And let me begin by thinking about, saying two things. First, the implementation challenges are not only for the Commission, but I think as Tim has pointed out, they are also very much for the gatekeepers, for the people who are subject to the DMA. And it's true that in conferences such as these, when we discuss, we have a tendency very much to think, the poor people at the Commission, they have to spend 12 hours a day in the meeting rooms on the Rue des Lois, which are not exactly exciting, listening to people speak to them. But actually, the gatekeepers also have a huge amount of work to do, and we really need to we can't think about the challenges of one party without thinking also about the challenges of the other party. The second point I would like to make, which is probably the one I want to speak more about, is I really hate the term implementation. Because the term implementation gives the idea that you have a blueprint, and it's a question of taking this blueprint and making sure that the thing is constructed. And I don't think that's really the way in which we should think of a DMA. We shouldn't think of, we've got a set of laws, and once they're implemented, that will be finished, we can wash our hands. In reality, the DMA will evolve. Okay? It will evolve, so in part, through the legal means which are written in the text, okay, designation of new gatekeepers, new obligations, and so on and so on. But it also evolved as basically as case law evolves in an organic way, depending on the way in which the Commission acts, depending on the. And so I think that one of the real challenges that the Commission especially is facing right now is that what they're doing is not only implementing the laws as it should be done in the next year, they are kind of basically steering the ship at the start in some direction from which it will be very difficult to steer it away. So for instance, depending on the amount of dialogue which they have with the gatekeepers, depending on the atmosphere in which this dialogue is conducted, depending on the penalties which they impose, for instance, to the gatekeepers who are not compliant, and how do you do all those things? It's going to have huge amount of repercussions, it seems to me, in the long run. And I think that's really one of the challenges which I really would want to stress is the fact that, Lucia, you are not only kind of implementing the law as it is now, but you are determining, you're giving birth to a new regulator who will be 20 years old probably sometime. And what you are doing now is going to determine what it will look at 20. And that, I think, is a really important challenge one needs to think about.
Thank you. So we have a different challenge, not a substantive one, but a more long-term challenge. Lucia, what are your reflections on this?
Yes, thank you, Giorgio, and thank you also to the Portuguese authority for inviting me to this beautiful city and amazing venue. And of course, with this distinguished panel, I think Giorgio called it cutting edge. So I don't know whether I'm cutting edge, but Jacques definitely is. So yes, so I mean, of course, we are, and I think it's a very good panel to actually discuss this question because we really have all aspects, and we also have the newcomer in the town. So Catherine is lucky because she can learn from our mistakes and then make one or two regulation much better in the UK. But yes, so maybe to set the scene, so at the stage where we are now is we are in, the designations are known, so we know which gatekeepers are supposed to comply with which obligations in relation to which services. And we are now in this implementation phase, working towards the compliance by 7 March next year. And I think that it came across very clearly from both interventions before me that this is a very complex task. And it's not complex only because it's technically complex, and because many of these obligations, of course, require huge engineering efforts on the side of gatekeepers. And I think Tim really scratched a little bit on that. But it's also, this is new. And this is new for gatekeepers, but also new for us. And as Jacques said, actually, what is happening here is we are really reshaping the business models. We are reshaping how European digital data economy works and will work. And of course, this is new, so mistakes will happen, but I can tell to everyone the intentions are good, I think, at this stage on all sides. So what will happen? So we are working with, I think we have a very constructive dialogue with all gatekeepers. We are trying to see how this text can be translated in practice in view of the business models of each and every of the gatekeepers, which are very different, as you know. And because the obligations are same for everyone, but the way these companies operate are very different. And so the question is now, where are we in those discussions? And I think, of course, there is expectation that there will be compliance, and I also have very high hopes. But there will be areas, gray areas, where we will have the situations of maybe half compliance. There may be areas where there will be non-compliance, either non-intentional or intentional, because it's just simply not accepted, because of course there will potentially be some challenges. And I think the main challenge from March onwards will also be the detection, because I think that what is also important to see DMA as a process, because of course now we will have the first solution in place, but what is also nice with DMA, that it's not something that we do by 7 March, now we work round the clock and then we will all sit empty-handed. So it's a process, it will take lots of adjustments and tweaks. And of course we are now trying to get it as right as we can, but it's unavoidable that there will be adjustments. Yes, I mean, I will just repeat that. We haven't done the DMA just to keep ourselves busy. Sometimes administrations like doing that, but I can tell you that the DMA had a very different objectives. So our ambition at this point in time is really to get it right, and to get it right for the business users, to deliver on the objectives of the DMA, which, as you know, are fairness for business users, to be able to overcome the network effects, the lock-ins of closed ecosystems, and also more contestability. So we expect and we hope to see really progressive, if not from day one, progressive reshaping of the markets in Europe, where we will see emergence of new companies, new business models, who before were not able to make it because just they didn't have access to these markets.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I turn to Catherine, now the UK will have a slightly different regime, perhaps more tailored than the DMA is. Do you envisage a similar set of challenges in terms of establishing a regulator, in terms of empowering users, or are there perhaps different nuances to the UK regime?
Thank you, and as my fellow panelists have said, thank you very much for the invitation to come here today and to speak. I don't think I'd necessarily call us the newcomer, but I think we're certainly the tortoise in this. If you're comparing the UK and the EU, we are slightly further behind the EU in terms of our implementation. So the UK digital markets regime, which is the kind of EU equivalent to the UK equivalent to the DMA, is still in the UK parliamentary process. And so we're expecting our legislation to pass hopefully in spring next year, subject to the normal parliamentary process, and to go live shortly afterwards, which does mean that we are much further behind in terms of thinking about some of these implementation questions. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the UK regime, but for anybody who isn't, the UK regime creates a new regulatory regime for the most powerful digital firms, and it gives the Digital Markets Unit, which is a new unit within the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, the responsibility for overseeing that regime. and it allows us to designate firms as having strategic market status. And our designation approach is slightly different. We have a 9-month evidence-based, rigorous investigation as to whether a firm has substantial entrenched market power, but also a position of strategic significance in a particular activity. And when a firm reaches that threshold, then we designate them with having strategic market status, and there are a number of implications of that. We're able to set conduct requirements, which are rules that govern the conduct of those firms in relation to the activity for which they're designated. We're also able to implement pro-competitive interventions, which are more focused on trying to address market features which might lead to the firm's particular position or their market power or their position of strategic significance, so addressing things like access to data or interoperability, and there are also additional merging reporting obligations in a similar way to the DMA. So as I say, we're a little bit earlier on in our journey, and I do identify with some of the challenges that my colleagues have raised. I think particularly those that Jack's mentioned, in terms of the sort of perennial thing in my mind at the moment is how do we make it an effective ex-ante regime as opposed to an ex-post one? How do we work with the designated firms and market participants more broadly to try and secure compliance rather than kind of fighting it out in the trenches after the matter has occurred? I don't think anyone, there will evidently be a little bit of both, but we'd rather be in the former than the latter camp. And that goes to every question in terms of how you implement the regime. I think you're right in saying the legislation gives us a set of tools, but different chefs can make very different meals with with the same sets of ingredients. And so there are so many strategic choices we can make in terms of how we prioritize, in terms of the strategy we choose to take, in terms of our approach, as you say, the kind of context in which these discussions take place. And so we're really focused on making sure that all of those choices try and lead to that sort of ex-ante regime. So how we set the conduct requirements, and as Lucia noted, we'll have the benefit of coming after the DMA and hopefully being able to set our conduct requirements having seen to what extent firms have complied with the DMA, but also how we monitor compliance on an ongoing basis, how we gather intelligence, how we do effective deterrence, and of course, the approach we take to enforcement. So I certainly identify with that sort of question around how do you make it work?
Okay, thank you very much. While you were speaking, it reminded me a lot of work that was done some years ago by Michel Calon on the law of markets, where he said, of course, every law makes markets. Markets are not sort of naturally born out of thin air. It's the law that creates them, and to a certain extent, both the DMA and whatever the UK law will become will shape markets. And I think it's interesting also, as you suggested, to think about the DMA more broadly in the context of the whole digital package rather than just one element. But if we zoom in on the DMA and assume these challenges about maybe implementation is the wrong word, design of regulation come about and firms comply, what do we expect to be the market outcomes? So the DMA says we want markets to be more contestable and fair, but can we be a bit more granular on what that might look like for either business users or consumers? Jacques first, perhaps.
Yeah, Giorgio and I have spent lots of time together through Zoom, but I think it's the first time we meet physically. And I thought he was a good friend, a Zoom good friend. And then I received the questions he was going to ask us, and there was this question. And my first reaction was, oh, how come I hadn't even thought about that question, which is clearly the obvious questions to ask? So there was a level of admiration. Then I looked at the list of the order in which he was going to ask the question, and I saw Jacques first. And then he became an enemy because I thought, what can I say? I mean, I should really have thought about this before, and I feel very stupid. So let me try to say a few things, hoping that they are useful. But it's the fundamental question. I mean, it's a really, really important question. So it's a little bit like, the previous questions. We could go obligation by obligation and say, what does this obligation, is it going to work, is it going to open things up, and so on. And then there are kind of interesting issues to how, if we do this, of how do we measure the outcome. So for instance, if we take one of my favorite, the opening up the app stores obligations, okay, how do we go and measure whether this is successful? Do we measure by looking at the number of app stores which have been created? Do we measure by looking at the number of downloads from the competing app stores, or do we go by measuring what are the changes in the apps which are being offered? So there are lots of interesting questions. Another way, complementary way, which I think might be also useful to slice it, would be to allocate the obligation into what I would call systemic obligation and what let me call band-aid obligations. And of course, those are two extreme ways of seeing it, and there are intermediaries. So the systemic obligations are the obligations which try to open up competition on the crucial element of a CPS. So for instance, the obligation 611, contrary to most of you, I need to go and check what is the number of the obligations because I am not a lawyer, I don't know all the obligations by heart. Okay? So 611, sharing the search engine data, okay, has got no interest unless it opens up the possibility for people to create new search engines. And you can only ask for that data if you are a search engine provider. So it's clearly, we've got Google who's dominating. Can we help others get the same benefit? So the only benefit is in some sense systemic if it increases the number of search engines. And there are others, what I call the band-aid obligations, which correct relatively small problems. So for instance, 5.9, where you have to provide information about the price of ads, how much you paid for different ads, and so on. Those can be very, very useful, but we don't think they're going to change the structure of the market. They're correcting small problems which the legislature thought were important and have been put in there. And actually, I've realized as I was thinking through this that one of the reasons I found that VMA a bit strange, it was because a mixture of those type of very big objectives and very relatively small objectives all mixed up, not being organized in this way. So my feeling is, of course, that the DMA would be successful in some of the smaller obligations. For instance, I think it would be successful in opening up the App Store market, and that's something which is actually quite important. Okay. On the other hand, I think we would be wrong to think, but I might be wrong also, to think that by itself it will open the competition between the gatekeepers in any spectacular way. And I think one of the issues is that in settings such as these, we have a tendency of focusing on anti-competitive behavior and a tendency of overemphasizing the role of anti-competitive behavior by the gatekeepers in maintaining or in developing their dominance. So, I don't know. We can sue Google all we want for buying the default position. It's probably a good thing to do, but I really don't think that Google is as successful as it is mainly because it's buying the default obligation. Okay, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight against it. And and there are a number of structural reasons for this. Okay, we tried very hard in the report which with Yves Alexandre de Montjoie and Heike Schweitzer we wrote for the Commissioner Vestager. We tried very hard to go through those structural element, but in particular network effects and increasing return to scales mean that we are going to have few firms, and those firms are going to be very, very hard to displace. I think it's totally, I think it's, you have to be very, very imaginative to imagine that you could have several, more than 2 at most search engines. I mean, the fixed costs are so high that it's very difficult to imagine, and I don't think that the DMA is going to be able to open up very much. Okay? The other thing which I think is striking is that 4 out of 6 gatekeepers were created at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. Okay, and we always hear, look, Facebook was able to displace MySpace, and hence the market is open. But they've been very stable since then. And actually, those firms have been incredibly innovative in the meantime. There's been not much sign of sclerosis in the way in which they are acting, which is a good thing. I mean, all the power for them, but which kind of reinforces this staying power. And I don't think that the DMA will dethrone them by itself. On the other hand, I think it can help if there are other structural changes which threatens the dominance of one of them. So keep on going on search, but there would be other example. It could be that generative artificial intelligence and the same techniques actually displace search as a way of accessing information on the web. In this case, it could be that the DMA will have opened up enough space in the competition to make that transition easier and preventing the blockage. So I'm not saying it's useless, I'm just saying that we can't expect grand soir, to speak French revolutionary languages. So the DMA will be useful. I don't think it would be revolutionary, but it's still really worthwhile doing. So it's not meant to be a criticism of the DMA process, just kind of a caution about the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a lot of your points focused on how markets will become more contestable, and as you said, different markets may move in different ways. Lucia, what's the regulator's view on this?
Where to start? So it's one of these questions, like they ask now, what will the success look like? I better start preparing for this question. But I must say that I'm a little bit more optimistic than Jacques, and it's not only because I'm young and naive, probably still, and also not because I'm paid for saying what I say, but also I truly believe in it. I think DMA has huge potential. Will it be a revolution on 7th of March? Will it be a big bang on 7th of March? Probably not on 7th of March, because I said it will take a long time. This will be like more like this 100 years war, like between France and England. But let's not go into that. So it will take a lot of time. I mean, of course, Jacques picked up on the search engines, and I think that's one of the kind of most Herculean tasks of DMA, or like kind of the most utopic ambition. But I think even there, over time, of course, we have 611. I mean, of course, we are not doing this just for sake of doing it. There must be companies out there which will decide that, no, I don't want to be only the syndication partner. I have an ambition to develop my own algorithm. I have an ambition to develop my own search engine. And how do I get there? So this is creating conditions. It gives you 611. Then we have 6.3 with choice screens. So you will be able to go on the choice screen, so hopefully that will over time lead to more contestability. I'm not naive. I do not think that now on 7th of March you will have a choice screen on your Android phone, and now everyone will start using DuckDuckGo instead of Google. I mean, probably many of us will not. But over time, if they develop all algorithm, if they take benefit of 611, of the search and query and click data, and they invest, because, all of this, maybe I'm not paid to say what I will say now, but so keep it for yourselves. But, these companies got there because they put huge investments. So we should also not forget about that this is not going to be this beautiful, rosy world without that having any cost for these challengers. And this cost, it's a process. They need to get there. The capital needs to come in because there are right conditions to grow. But what DMA is doing, DMA is opening these markets, it's creating the opportunities. And I'm going to go away from 611 because I don't think that's the easiest one. But let's think about opening up the app economy. There is one new supermarket or two new supermarkets in town. Over time, people will realize that there is good stuff in there as well, right? And potentially the same stuff, but cheaper. So I think that this is not innocuous. These are big things which over time will reshape the markets. Another one, 6.7, vertical interoperability, opening up the closed ecosystems. There will be now services offered on iPhone, which before you didn't even. I have two iPhones, one for work, one personal. Fantastic product. But there are things that you didn't even know existed. And now all these other companies will be able to access you, as an end user, and offer you the services. So this is what DMA is doing. The DMA, and really these objectives of fairness and contestability, it has become a little bit of a cliche because, it's very fluffy words. But I think these are genuine objectives. This is what we have in mind in the long run, to have more companies that can actually come with innovative solutions, with innovative business models. And it will take time. It will take time, but I'm really hopeful that this is more than one other regulation which will just slightly move things around.
Thank you. More optimism here. Catherine?
Oh. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah. I'll talk again from a UK perspective, and evidently, again, because we're a little bit further behind, we don't have our conduct requirements yet, so the specific outcomes that those will deliver are a little bit harder to crystal ball gaze. But I mean, I guess talking at a high level about the outcomes that our digital markets regime aims to achieve, they're very, very similar, and there's a huge degree of overlap with the DMA. We see our regime heavily grounded in competition and consumer policy, and therefore talk about the outcomes in terms of consumers, businesses, and the economy. So in terms of consumers, it's about ensuring consumers have open choices. And Tim, in his opening remarks, talked a bit about, open choices and the importance of that and what that might mean. It's about ensuring that consumers can have a free choice in terms of the providers they use and procure goods and services from the service provider that gives them the best choice and price and value for money and all of those good things. It's about ensuring that they can switch provider without losing their content or losing their data, and about ensuring that they are treated fairly without misleading practices or exploitation. When we talk about businesses, it's about ensuring that businesses can innovate and thrive and grow, that they are able to compete fairly against the designated firms, and again, that they are treated fairly to the extent that they rely on the designated firms for access to market, for example. And then when we talk about the economy, again, it's about ensuring that competition and consumer policy can support the economy in growing sustainably and productively. That there can be you can stimulate investment, innovation, productivity. So, I mean, it's very high level, but it's essentially the same goals that competition and consumer policy have always sort of grounded themselves in.
Okay. Thank you. That's an interesting perspective because the DMA announces this is not competition law, and yet the sort of end results for empowering users or facilitating the entry of dynamic business are more or less the daily meal of our competition authority. From a regulatee perspective, Tim, what do you think will happen after the DMA?
So I am involved in the implementation, so sorry to use that word. As to some of the outcomes that you're asking about, I think you're going to see it in different waves. I think you're seeing it now in relation to Meta. We are changing our business model right now, and that is as a result of the DMA, that is as a result of the GDPR, and that is a new choice that we are presenting to users. I'm happy to go into that further. But I think what we're thinking about is this idea of contestability, is this idea of fairness with business users. And I think they're grand aims, and I think they're laudable aims. But when you've got these enormous aims and these very laudable aims, what I try and do is break it down into chunks and thinking about how you get there and what is the process by which you break down the conditions for market contestability. And so I think if you do that, you suddenly identify potential stepping stones or ends in themselves for how you think about that market contestability. And I think one of the necessary preconditions for it is user choice, right? I'm going to come back to that because I think it's an underplayed consideration in the DMA. It's an underplayed promise of the DMA, and it's the potential beauty of the DMA. And the DMA choice, whilst we talk about fairness with business users and providing choice to business users, that's definitely there, but you get there by providing choices to end users. And you see that across a number of the provisions in the DMA, even if it's not always expressly spelt out. And so you obviously see it in relation to data combination. You obviously see it now. One of the specific choices that we're offering to users is the idea to have, or the opportunity to have no ads on Facebook and or Instagram. It is your choice. But you also, and you're seeing that right now, and as we get to DMA Day, with my company, you will see more of those choices, and that is going to be immediate. We are talking about the next 3 to 4 months, so you will see that. I think in relation to other provisions of the DMA, the choice is there, right? The choice has to be put out there, and it has to be put out there quite quickly. So in relation to app stores, yes, wouldn't it be great to have a different way of getting your app distributed across Europe? Right, distributed to users. Right, why do you have to go through 2 app stores? Why can you not sideload your apps? I think that is a question that has to be asked, and that is a key priority. That is a promise of the DMA. That is the potential beauty of the DMA. Similarly in relation to browsers, similarly in relation to virtual assistants, one day maybe, similarly in relation to payment services, the choice has to be presented. If that choice is presented, yes, people may seek to exercise that choice. And that is the immediate promise of the DMA. And I think we're very keen to talk about that. We're also keen to talk about the choice about bolstering your end user data portability. Right? That promise is in the DMA. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it because we've been doing it for a very long time. And we have felt the repercussions of doing that outside and before some of the frameworks were actually set up. Right. So a lot of the criticism we have faced over the past 5, 6 years is as a result of doing end-user data portability. And we're going to have to talk about that and talk about how you provide that choice in a meaningful way whilst respecting the privacy obligations that we face across different regulatory instruments, not only across Europe, but across the world, that do impact our ability to offer you end-user data portability. And so whilst I think that there are market outcomes that may come in 15, 20 years' time. There are outcomes that you will see now. And that is the beauty of the DMA. But I would emphasize that that promise of user choice could be seen as a stepping stone to market contestability, but could be an end in itself. Right? You may find that the choices that people are currently making are the choices they will continue to make because they are the right choice for them. And so I wouldn't focus on how people are exercising that choice. That is obviously a point of discussion. But I would think of the DMA as simply positing the opportunity for users and business users to make that choice and to have that choice. And that, I think, is what we're focused on as a company. It's what I'm focused on in our implementation. And I think you're going to see a lot of that in the run-up to the DMA day.
Okay, thank you. So an immediate result. I'll abuse my power and make a couple of comments. First of all, on choice, people seldom switch things that are much simpler. Energy providers, banks. So we've seen that designing the correct choice architecture is a long-term challenge. Yes, sure, the provider may offer choice today, but whether that design of choice is optimal, whether the user responds, whether the user is sufficiently empowered. So I'm wondering if more imaginative regulatory techniques are necessary to stimulate the right environment for the user to make that choice. So for example, when you buy white goods, you have labels that clearly tell you green, oh, this is better than red. And that gives you the immediacy without necessarily needing to know the details. For bank credit cards, you have an APR number, which allows you to compare different banks. So I think choice is a really complicated thing. And indeed, yes, one may immediately implement a choice architecture. Whether that's the right one straight away, maybe more of a work in progress. In terms of fairness, just one comment. Fairness is with respect to business users. And of course, many of you used it in the context of if the CPS is fair to the user, that stimulates contestability. So in a sense, the two aims kind of feed in. But I'm wondering if fairness is in itself a value that the DMA seeks to encourage. Because the way in which fairness is designed is like the rents are taken by the gatekeeper and are kept from the provider. Also, fairness is not necessarily only towards other digital players. If Amazon has to behave fairly towards its sellers, the sellers may be selling perfumed soap, but they still need to be treated fairly. So it's a concept which I think is a little bit more broad than just a means to generate contestability in those markets. Okay, if you don't want to come back, let's move on. The organizers asked me to think about global perspectives as well. So I wanted to ask some of you whether you think the DMA holds lessons for other regimes that are contemplating similar regulatory moves. And Catherine, perhaps you can start us.
I mean, I think it's very early to be. There is, as Lucia was saying, the DMA still has a long, long way to run, and we're going to be talking about, how the extent to which it's effective over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So I think it's very early, but obviously, as I say, we're watching closely, and we have the benefit of being able to follow. I'm very interested in what my fellow panelists think we should be taking from it, and of course from the audience as well. So yeah, very interested in your views. I mean, from an outsider's perspective, one thing I did want to sort of remark on, which was a point that Jack's made at the outset, was sort of the manner of engagement between the Commission and the designated gatekeepers and market participants more broadly. I mean, in the UK, we've talked a lot about a participative approach and the importance of having that dialogue, and I think we've seen a bit of a flavour of that in the sort of workshops and the way that the Commission have engaged with market participants more broadly in talking about implementation. So I think from our perspective, we're definitely looking at that closely, both in terms of a means of engagement, but also in terms of the way in which that conversation is being conducted, but also the outcomes from it. So, I mean, I'm interested in other panelists' views on that, but I think that's one thing in particular that we'll take from it.
Okay. And Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're fully signed up to that participative approach. I think we've met with Lucia's team a lot over the past year. So I think we're fully signed up to that, and I think it goes back to what you were saying, Giorgio, about the choice as well and how you design that choice. I don't think it's a once and done. I think it's going to be an iterative approach. It's going to be a dialogue that we have with the regulators, with both Lucia and Catherine and her teams, and I think we're fully engaged in that and fully signed up to that. There is one thing, and I forgot to mention it, and it's a minor point around market outcomes, but what I did find interesting, and it's probably not something you necessarily want to dwell on too much, but it's when Microsoft were talking about the future of Bing in Europe. And I found that to be an interesting dynamic and an interesting thought about the trade-offs, because the idea that the compliance costs on Bing would impact the ability to deliver Bing in Europe is an interesting dynamic. Probably something worth thinking about a tiny bit. Bing is just the example that's out there, but it's an interesting thought as to, well, Bing's not core to Microsoft's, from what I can see, but the compliance costs of certain regulations, and your ability to push out products that are potentially mavericks is quite interesting. I think that's an interesting dynamic that should be considered, actually. Okay, thank you. Can I just ask you a little bit more about participation? So participation can often be between the regulator and the regulatee. But what about broadening participation to other groups like consumers or business users? Is that unnecessary, problematic? What's your thoughts?
Shall I offer? I mean, from our perspective, that is absolutely crucial to the participative approach. When we talk about participative approach, it's certainly not restricted to only being between the regulator and the designated firm. There are so many risks inherent in that, not least regulatory capture. So we absolutely always think about participative approach in terms of that broader dialogue. And I think one of the things that we're thinking hard about is the mechanisms by which we bring in and channel intelligence from those broader market participants, particularly when you think about monitoring. Often we're going to be reliant on that intelligence to understand the extent to which firms are actually complying. And we need those third parties to be able to engage with us, to be able to trust us, to be able to engage with us in a way that provides us with that information. So we're thinking hard about the different mechanisms that we might be able to use to bring in that intelligence, absolutely understanding that there are lots of different regulators to talk to and everybody has massive draws on their time. So how can we make it easy for people? And there are lots of really interesting parallels, not only in other regulatory regimes across the world, but also in other regulatory regimes in other sectors. We've been talking quite a lot in relation to the groceries, and the dynamic between big retailers and suppliers and the sort of intelligence you can gather there and the mechanisms that have been used to try and draw that out. So I think there's a lot we can learn, but certainly headline participative approach is certainly about more than the dialogue between the SMS firm and the regulator.
But perhaps, so I'm deviating a bit from the script, but I'm intrigued because could participation not also be something where the regulator is not present? That is to say, isn't securing participation part of the process of compliance? I don't know, what's your views on this?
Yeah, I think we're doing that at the moment in relation to Article 7 of the DMA, so we're engaging with third parties on that front, and I think it's definitely a useful exercise as you build out sort of compliance solutions. I think there's a risk it goes too far as well, and so I think you do have to focus on the solutions and the discussions between the regulated entity and the regulator. I think that is primordial. I think you can get input from third parties as you do in any merger control process. I don't think there's much new there, but I would caution against spending too much time thinking about whether everyone is happy. Not everyone will be happy, that's not the point. The point is compliance with the DMA, the point is honoring the text of the DMA. And honoring the promise of the DMA, not necessarily reaching out to every complainant out there and turning it into a complainant's charter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, yes, because I think obviously what you said is true. We cannot be present at every single discussion between the beneficiaries and the gatekeeper, and we don't want to, but I mean, for it to work, these discussions need to take place. I mean, it has its own dynamics, and I mean, we could have a whole discussion about that, so let's not go into that, because as you know, that some of these companies now may think that, it's a total buffet, or endless buffet, which is not the case. DMA is what it is, and the Estima rightly said we need to focus on that between the regulation and the regulated entity. But these discussions with beneficiaries are unavoidable and necessary. And sometimes it makes sense for us to be there. Sometimes it doesn't, because it's just not needed. So I think that it's unavoidable so that this takes place. And maybe on the question itself, as it came about the lessons, so I mean, clearly it would be reckless for me to be giving lessons at this point in time. But what I would just say is that these companies are global, that the behaviors and the conducts we are trying to tackle are global. The iPhone is the same in the UK, in the European Union, or in the US. And there is a lot of, everyone wants to do at their sauce. So I think it's important that we coordinate these efforts. And this will be, I think, the challenge at the global stage as these new regimes start mushrooming around the world, that we don't forget that we are trying to achieve the same thing, and that this kind of little bit of a colonization pride is set aside, and we try to do it together, because I don't think it's in anyone's interest that now the companies either start playing us against each other or simply it becomes impossible for them to comply because everyone wants something else. So, it has to be something which is feasible, which makes sense, which delivers on objectives we all hope for. We can call it fairness, we can call it contestability, but fundamentally we all are trying to preach for the same thing.
Okay, thank you.
Can I rebound on this? I think that's a really interesting issue because I think in the ideal universe, we would have one world in which we would implement the DMA, one world in which we would implement the DMU, and then compare the results. And, I was more partisan.
Economy speaking.
I don't know which one.
I was more partisan of the DMU way, but, if they're in two different universes, that's fine, and we could compare them. So there's a tendency of saying, let's have experimentation and have different people do different forms of regulation and look at them. But indeed, we have only one universe in which what's happening in one experimentation affects what's happening on the other one, and we can't cut up things that cleanly. And I think that's really, I kind of enjoy the discussion here about how you have to collaborate. It's a second best. I mean, the real best would be to clone the universe, but I don't know how to do that. So
Let me know when you do that.
The last point which I would like to say, one thing which I'm a little bit disappointed about is that we hear relatively few discussions about whether or not we could renovate competition policy to make it a little bit more adapted to that new world. I mean, I think there are things about, trying to think more about whether or not we could reverse the burden of proof for some practices and so on, which could still be useful and also hit on practices not only of the gatekeepers, but also of other firms who could do things which are anti-competitive. And I'm kind of somewhat surprised that that doesn't seem to be a very active discussion around those things. But that's a side issue.
Yeah, but let me go back on experimentation. Yeah, we cannot have two worlds. But what about if a corporation were to say, I need to design a choice architecture. I'm not entirely sure what to do. I have these two models, so I'll try this model in Portugal and this model in Italy, and both, to me, look decent choice architecture, but by trialing them out, I can then work out which one makes people more responsive to. Would a regulator be against this kind of regulatory experimentation by the regulated firm?
Well, I must say, Giorgio, that now we are struggling to have one design architecture. No one came, here is A, B, and C choose. So if that comes, we'll deal with that question. But Tim may comment on that, whether they want to venture into a Portuguese version of, of Facebook and whatever French one.
Yeah, I think the general point for us is we are a cross-border service, right? You want to communicate with people in other countries. You want to connect with people in other countries. And so there is a keen emphasis from our side on having sort of harmonization in the EU, outside the EU. I think when you see new regimes being suggested and popping up and suggesting that you need different back-end infrastructures at some point, that may not be something that can be entertained at several levels. So we're going to have to see, well, we would love to see a coordination as you see new regimes develop. I also think that coordination is essential within Europe itself, as between the data protection authorities and as between the competition authorities. I know that the CMA in the UK and the DMU in the UK work closely with ICO. I think we're going to have to see that in relation to the implementation and the rolling out of the DMA as well, because there's some really major touch points that are potentially currently underexplored, I would say.
Thank you. And maybe this leads me to my next set of questions, which is indeed about coordination. And perhaps we can start with Catherine's experience in the UK, because a few years ago, the Digital Competition Regulation Forum was set up Cooperation Forum was set up particularly to work out how to coordinate regulation. Of course, the UK has a long experience of concurrency also since the Competition Act, with making sure regulators and competition agencies act in a coordinated manner. Now, when I spoke to people in this unit several years ago, they were saying the first thing we need to do is we need to learn each other's language, because we may be using the same terminology, but we may mean very different things depending on which side of the regulatory bench we stand on. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about how the forum is working now?
Yeah, of course. So in the UK, we have this thing called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is a voluntary forum comprised of the Competition and Markets Authority, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the UK data protection regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the UK Financial Services Regulator, and Ofcom, which is the UK Communications Regulator. And it was really born of recognition that we all face shared challenges in terms of regulating digital markets. So we all have slightly different policy objectives, but we all are regulating the same set of companies, or will be regulating the same set of companies. And the aim was really we talk about the work that the DRCF does in terms of three areas: coherence, cooperation, and capability. So I guess to give you some examples, coherence is really about thinking about how our different policy objectives align. So to give a concrete example, we have spent a lot of time, as Tim noted, working with the ICO, talking about the interaction between competition and data protection. And we've put out a joint statement, and it's really about trying to articulate how you can try and achieve interventions which promote competition in a way that does no harm to people's data protection rights, how you can try and advance regulation which essentially achieves both ambition. One doesn't come at the cost of the other, which is how they're sometimes posited. In terms of cooperation, we try to work cooperatively on common problems. So to give another example, algorithms is something that all four regulators are spending a lot of time trying to understand, thinking about the risks and the benefits to their particular policy objectives. Rather than have four separate teams and four separate regulators doing exactly the same research, we come together and we think about it collectively. And we're doing lots of work thinking about, we've just done a call for inputs on procurement of algorithmic systems. So if you're a small business who's looking to procure an algorithmic system, what should you be looking out for to ensure that that will still deliver in and comply with data protection, communications, financial services, competition law, consumer law? So we work collectively on common problems. And then the last one is on building capability, and that goes right through from how we recruit to horizon scanning, which is one thing that we've spent a lot of time working together on. Again, all four regulators are spending a certain amount of time trying to understand new technologies. What should we be looking out for? How will that impact competition, consumers, data protection, online safety, whatever it is? Rather than having four separate teams and four separate regulators, why don't we do it jointly? So we've had these symposiums on things like the metaverse, on quantum technologies, and the cooperation is very much focused on the policy level, but I would say that it's that point, as you say, about learning each other's language. When we come to cooperate on a formal level, when it comes to enforcement cases, of course that's done generally bilaterally through formal mechanisms, legal mechanisms. But it means you have a leg up, because not only do you understand the other organisation's priorities or how they come about an issue, you also have the personal relationships, and you understand it's exactly that point. It's culture, it's language, it's how each regulator does business, and that is invaluable when you then come to cooperate formally. So I think we've taken a lot from it. It's growing and growing every year. It's doing more and more. We've just launched the AI sandbox, and I think there's a huge amount that can be learned from that. But I also think you could apply that in other contexts. And we've talked a bit about international cooperation. I totally agree with everything Lucia said. We absolutely do not see divergence for divergence sake, and I think you could say the same things: coherence, capability, cooperation in international context as well. I think there's a lot we could do with other regulators, and EU particularly. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, the DMA recognizes this. It institutes the high-level group, but as Catherine observes, it's really the more granular level where work needs to be done, so high-level is one thing. And the other oddity about the EU, of course, because of its unusual constitutional structure, is that we have EU level and national level, and the interplay with these, because so on the one hand, there needs to be coordination between the DMA enforcer, the Commission, and the national competent authorities that play a helping hand, and different legislation is empowering different agencies in slightly different ways. And then there's a relationship between the enforcement of the DMA and the application of national competition law or EU regulation implemented at national level, like the GDPR that we've discussed. So I'm wondering from the three of you, what are the challenges of making the system work, or where you think the friction points are? And I'll start with Tim with this one.
Thank you. So actually, just on Catherine's points around the different...
Things are falling apart.
I think we are being too long.
I'll be brief. So I think the point about different languages and different regulatory counterparts having different languages and different approaches and different cultures, I think is so true, and it's actually important to have that dialogue, because you understand you're often talking about very different things, and often the very same thing, and that's particularly relevant when you branch out into the data protection space, sort of as we've had to do. And maybe the thing I'd like to focus on then is that interplay between the DMA maybe and the GDPR, and then eventually the DMU and the UK equivalent, because ultimately the GDPR is cross-referenced throughout the DMA on numerous occasions, and I think the jumping off point, the starting point, will be recital 12 of the DMA, that in sort of crude terms just say that the DMA is not trying to replace the GDPR. The DMA is a supplement to the GDPR. It's not trying to replace it in any way. And I think that is important. I also think that is an easy point to jump off from, because what happens then when you go beyond that is that, and we're seeing it right now, you have a kaleidoscope of different regulatory obligations from each regime. Not only GDPR, not only DMA, there are other regulations out there that create touch points with those regimes. And so you could imagine that there is something that is perfectly permissible under the DMA, that is actually quite an elegant way of making something work, but which is now not permissible under the GDPR, which is now not permissible under EPD. And you're going to have to understand those touch points to understand some of the solutions that some of the companies may be pushing out in the run-up to the DMA and in future years to come, because I think it's going to be key to understanding how you get to those solutions and to avoid potential conflicts of laws. And I think it's a mundane point, it's a boring point, but it's something that is critical in understanding sort of the regulatory space in which some of the companies are now operating. I think there's the forum that Catherine mentioned in the UK. I think the closest equivalent I can see in the DMA is Article 40 and the high-level working group that contains a lot of promise to sort of start exploring those issues and potentially explore those issues in quite some depth. I think at some point it may make sense for the relevant data protection authority, that is the primary regulator of some companies, to sit in the room with the competition authorities and actually have meetings with the companies themselves to sort of understand the touch points. But maybe first, I think it'd be interesting to see how the Article 40 high-level working group sort of operates and evolves, and whether that can progress some of the discussions. But I think those touch points are actually going to be very critical.
Thank you. Jacques?
Yeah, I don't have much to say. One thing which is very striking to me is the following. In some sense, we could think about the presence of the different regulatory agencies as we've got a body politic who needs to check on different things in the economy and says to this guy, you are supposed to check on data, this one on competition, this one on, and so on and so on. So the different regulatory agencies are, in some sense, the expression of a well-defined common will, political will. Okay? it seems to me that actually the situation is kind of not at all as good as this, because we have trade-offs. Okay, so we have trade-offs between privacy, whatever it means, and the use of data in order to provide efficient services. And we don't want to look at those trade-offs personally, and certainly it's very, very painful for politicians to make those trade-offs explicitly. So they have a tendency of saying, oh, I'm all for privacy, and I'm all for efficiency, and not say, well, yeah, but, and so you tell one body, okay, you go full gang-go on protecting privacy, another one, oh, you're responsible for, but you don't take upon yourself to do the hard work of determining the interface. And I'm a little bit worried that, in particular with all the issue of data protection, we are finding ourselves in a system which is badly designed, but in some sense badly designed on purpose, because we don't want to face the choices which we have to face. And I don't have a solution. I mean, just one point. I mean, one thing which is from an economic viewpoint, there was quite a bit of research on the economics of the regulatory system. So the internal, not what the regulators should do, but the internal functioning of a regulatory system in the 1990s, and this has basically disappeared. There's very, very little research that economists are doing on the way in which the regulatory systems are working, and there are clearly things there which are not basically very linked to the economics of organization, on which intelligent work could be done, which it couldn't solve all the problems, God knows, but it would maybe help a little bit.
But there's a bit of a tension, isn't there, between the sort of granular problem-solving approach that Catherine advocated and your more general concern that maybe there's a more ideological difference, that if two regulators are tasked with doing two very different things, then the regulatory conversations become much poorer or maybe richer, but the challenge is how to reconcile competing interests within the House. Lucia?
Yeah. I think one thing is sure, that this is an extremely complex regulatory environment. And another thing is sure, that despite Tim being paid much more than me, I would not like to have his job these days. So I totally appreciate the task and the frustrations that are stemming from trying to square the regulatory circle these days. But if we unpack it a bit, and we've been talking about DMA obviously today, there is let's say, a couple of angles one could look at. One is, of course, that the Commission is the exclusive enforcer of the DMA, but we all know that this is a Herculean task, and thank God we are not alone, and I think this is the right place to say that we rely on competencies which we have in our member states and on the network of European competition authorities and the whole ECN network, which has been working for years very well and is extremely effective. And I think the member state authorities are very well placed actually to help with the detection and non-compliance investigations in the member states, in their territories, which they know the best. So that's really what the Article 38 tries to engineer, is really this cooperation with national competition authorities. Then we have, of course, the interaction between the DMA and competition law. And there, of course, the elephant in the room is what is DMA, where does it start, where does it end, and what is competition law. So there I would just make general remarks that, of course, some of the conducts can be captured by both. And I think that the whole point of this is not to do the duplication, right? So if there is a certain conduct which is captured by both, it may be more efficient to deal with it ex ante through DMA. But of course, the reality is much more complex. And the real question is really on the edges, the gray zones. And there, when we come to the gray zones, there, of course, the competition law is a much better place to deal with it, with this inherent flexibility in investigating the new conducts, the situations we don't know, because, of course, the DMA was written based on the experience of competition enforcement. It's really the competition law is the enforcement is the incubator of all these obligations and of the future obligations which will be added later on to the DMA. And I think this is the right sequence of the evolution. And then, of course, there are interactions with other regimes, and that's where it's becoming even more tricky. Tim mentioned the GDPR, which is, again, another institutional setup, which is bringing in many other authorities, actually, to the table. We have, as you mentioned, Giorgio, the high-level group, so we are trying to get this cohesion through this high-level group, but the practice will show how it works. And it's really this comment I made when I was talking about the various regimes at the international level. I think it's in everyone's interest that we make it feasible for these companies to comply, because if complying becomes impossible, then we haven't achieved anything.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes, and I wonder if anybody in the audience has a question or a comment they'd like to make. Oh, sorry, go ahead. There's a question in front? Thank you.
Is there a microphone?
It's coming.
Sorry.
Hi, Miguel Moreira Silva from the Portuguese Competition Authority. I have a provocation on my more academic perspective rather than my current position at the Competition Authority. And my question is, particularly to the Commission, do you envisage a role of private enforcement in ensuring that these new obligations under Articles 5, 6, and 7 are complied with? And the reason I ask this is because unlike Regulation 1, 2003, the DMA does not include a provision stating that these obligations produce direct effect in the sense that they may be invoked without a prior decision from the Commission. So my question to you is, how are you thinking about the interplay between public enforcement, the sole enforcer role of the Commission, and the likelihood that there will be private enforcement? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting question for all the panels, so maybe 1 minute each on this, and then we can wrap up.
Well, I can start, but then I think that the most scared of private enforcement is Tim in this room. But yes, I mean, of course, there is private enforcement. This is regulation with a directly applicable obligation. I mean, there is a whole case law under which conditions these provisions are directly enforceable, and there is an expectation that this will happen, obviously, and I think that there is a legitimate concern also on the side of the gatekeepers that many of these obligations will be invoked by national judges. Then how it's going to play in practice, whether the national judge will venture itself into interpreting these obligations or will contact us, or there will be prejudicial ruling here or there, that we'll have to see. But I mean, I can positively say that there will be private enforcement of DMA.
Catherine?
I mean, I don't have much more to say. I mean, we're in a similar position. As the bill stands at the moment, there is private enforcement, but obviously our bill is still subject to amendment. I think we see the benefits of it in terms of their, allowing complainants to access redress and through the courts. But at the same time, there are obviously challenges for the regulator in the way Lucia's talked about, particularly thinking about the coherence of the regime, and the approach and the philosophy you're trying to embed early on. So, yeah, I guess we'll have to see how it plays out.
Thank you.
Private litigation. I see
Don't say you haven't thought of that, Tim.
I see some friends in the audience who must be thinking about it. I think it's just something to look forward to. I think, look, seriously, joking about, I think it does touch on. So I think it's a point that's out there. It happens under the GDPR as well. It's interesting to think through then what is the dynamic between the regulator and the regulated, and what is the value of the dialogue that is taking place. I don't have an answer to that, but I don't want Lucia's job. I'm very happy with my job. I'm sure Lucia's thought about it a lot more than I have.
Thank you. Jacques?
I've got nothing intelligent to say.
So say a joke, crack a joke, Jacques.
Then it just remains me to thank the panel. Thank you very much for your insights on how this regime will play out. We damaged some of the furniture, but we didn't bring the house down, so I think we were successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.